Yokosuka Naval Base, September 1st, 1945. Tomorrow morning, the papers would be signed on the deck of the Missouri. The ceremony was planned, the delegations assembled, the cameras positioned. The war in the Pacific would end formally at 9 o'clock in Tokyo Bay. But that was tomorrow. Today, the man who had commanded the largest naval force in the history of the United States was walking through what was left of the enemy's most important naval installation. The docks, the dry docks, the repair yards that had once kept the Imperial Japanese Navy in the fight. Nimitz walked at it the way he walked at everything, quietly, without an entourage pressing in around him, without reporters trailing behind. He had been doing the work of 4 years. Now he was doing what came after. And then he stopped. There was a ship, if you could still call it that, sitting on dry land at the edge of the harbor. It had not been to sea in more than 20 years. Its hull was encased in concrete. Paint was peeling off the upper works. American occupation soldiers had already stripped out equipment, clocks, anything useful or worth taking home as a souvenir. The ship's name was Mikasa. If you had gone to the United States Naval Academy any time in the first 40 years of the 20th century, you knew that name. Every officer who had studied naval warfare knew what had happened at Tsushima Strait in May of 1905, when Admiral Heihachi Togo stood on the bridge of that ship and destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in 2 days of fighting. The Russians had spent 7 months sailing from the Baltic Sea to reach those waters. What was left of their navy at the end of it could have fit in a harbor the size of a city block. Tsushima was the reason the Japanese believed they could build an empire. It was also the reason the Russians never forgot. Now the Soviet Union, America's ally, the country whose soldiers had just fought their way to Berlin, was formally demanding that the Mikasa be demolished. Tsushima had humiliated Russia in front of the world. The Mikasa was the physical monument to that humiliation. The Soviets wanted it gone. They had leverage. They were at the table. They were pressing the point. Nimitz looked at the ship. He gave an order. Guards were posted on the Mikasa, American guards, with instructions that no further deterioration was to be permitted, and that no one was going to lay a hand on that ship. Not because Washington had told him to. Not because MacArthur had issued a directive. Because Chester Nimitz, the man who had just finished dismantling the Imperial Japanese Navy piece by piece over 4 years of war, had walked up to the flagship of its greatest admiral, the day before accepting its surrender, and decided it was not going to disappear. This isn't the story of how Nimitz won the Pacific War. That story has been told. This is the story of what he did with his victory, and why that turned out to be the harder thing. Go back 40 years, the summer of 1905. Midshipman Chester Nimitz was 20 years old, assigned to the USS Ohio, a battleship making port calls in the Western Pacific. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in Annapolis earlier that year. He was a young officer in training in a navy that had only recently fought its first real war in the Pacific, against Spain in 1898, and was still working out what it was supposed to be and do in a world that was changing faster than doctrine could keep up with. The Emperor of Japan was throwing a garden party. It was a celebration of the victory over Russia. The first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European one in open battle. It was all people in that garden may not have fully understood it yet. One of the turning points of the 20th century. Japan had demonstrated something the Western powers had spent a long time telling themselves was not possible. Officers from foreign navies stationed in the region were invited to attend. Nimitz was among the young American officers selected to represent the United States. He went, and he stood in a garden in Tokyo and watched Heihachi Togo move through the crowd. Togo was 57 years old that summer. He had spent his career learning his profession with the same patience and thoroughness that the Japanese military applied to everything it decided was worth mastering. He had studied in England for 7 years as a young man, learning Western naval science from the country that had the best navy in the world. He had come home and applied it. He had spent the Russo-Japanese War commanding from the bridge of the Mikasa, exposing himself to fire the way commanding officers of that era were expected to. Because the men on the ships behind him needed to see where he was. What he had done at Tsushima was not complicated to describe. He had predicted that the Russian fleet, after 7 months and 18,000 miles at sea, would try to reach Vladivostok through the strait between Japan and Korea. He had positioned his ships to intercept. When the Russian line appeared through the early morning haze on May 27, 1905, he had ordered his fleet to turn across the head of the enemy column, a maneuver called crossing the T, which concentrated all of his broadsides against ships that could only reply with their forward guns. The Russians never recovered. 21 warships sunk, 6 more captured. The Russian Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force in the Pacific in the space of 2 days. By any measure available to the men standing in that garden in the summer of 1905, Togo was the greatest naval commander alive. He was talking and laughing with a group of young American officers. Not performing, not receiving the reverence that a man of his standing could have demanded and received without effort. Just talking. The way a man talks when he has nothing left to prove. When the work is done and the record speaks for itself, and there is no longer any need to be anything other than what you actually are. Nimitz left no written record of what was said that afternoon. No diary entry that has survived, no letter home describing the conversation. But the image stayed with him. You can tell, because of what he did 29 years later. In 1934, Admiral Togo died. He was 86 years old. His funeral was a national event in Japan, a country that had built a mythology around him, that had named shrines in his honor, that treated him the way Americans of that era treated figures like Washington or Grant. Chester Nimitz, by then a captain himself, a man with a full schedule, with responsibilities that did not pause for travel to foreign countries, went to Tokyo. He attended the public funeral. He attended the private family funeral as well. Both of them. No diplomatic instruction required it. No order from the Navy Department. No protocol that demanded his presence at the family service rather than just the official ceremony. He went because he wanted to be there. Because something about that afternoon in 1905 had settled into him somewhere and stayed. Through his years in submarines, through the Naval War College, through every post and assignment and promotion. And when the man died, Nimitz made the trip. He never explained it publicly. He didn't have to. 3 months before Togo's garden party, something had happened in the aftermath of Tsushima that the newspapers covered briefly and then moved past. Vice Admiral Zinoviy Rozhestvensky, the Russian officer who had commanded the Baltic Fleet on its long voyage to destruction, was lying in a naval hospital in Sasebo, Japan, recovering from wounds he had taken during the battle. He had been found unconscious on a destroyer, transferred to a Japanese hospital ship, and brought ashore. He would survive his wounds. He would be repatriated to Russia. He would spend years afterward trying to make sense of what had happened at Tsushima, writing about it, defending decisions that may not have been defensible. But in June of 1905, he was lying in a bed in Sasebo. Togo came to see him. He walked into the hospital ward, sat down beside the bed, and took the Russian admiral's hand. The accounts of the visit that survived recorded what Togo said. Defeat is an accident to the lot of all fighting men, and there is no occasion to be cast down by it if we have done our duty. The man who had just won the most decisive naval battle in 40 years, sitting beside the man who had just lost it, saying that, not for the press, Not for the record. Not because protocol required a visit between senior officers. The Japanese press noted the visit briefly. There was no statement issued, no ceremony attached to it. It was one officer going to a hospital to see another officer who had been wounded in a battle between them. Whatever passed between them in that room stayed in that room. Nimitz knew about this visit. He had studied Togo thoroughly. Not just the tactics at Tsushima, not just the fleet dispositions and the maneuver that ended the Russian Navy's presence in the Pacific. He had paid attention to what Togo did when the gun stopped. The visit to the hospital, the words spoken at the bedside of a beaten man. He had been paying attention since he was 20 years old. Standing in a garden in Tokyo, watching an old admiral who had just won the greatest naval battle of the century talk to a group of young Americans. Like none of that was the point. That kind of thing leaves a mark. The kind that shows up 40 years later in a shipyard in Yokosuka, when you're the one who has just won. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay, the deck of the USS Missouri. MacArthur's selection to oversee the surrender ceremony had irritated Nimitz, and he had said so, not to reporters, but to Admiral King in Washington and the officers around him. A general from the Army had been handed the most visible moment of a war, that the Navy and Marine Corps had fought island by island across the width of the Pacific Ocean. Men had died on beaches at Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima and 100 smaller places that no one back home could find on a map. Sailors had gone down with their ships in the waters off Guadalcanal. Submariners had sailed into Japanese shipping lanes and not come back. And a general was standing at the microphone. Nimitz said his piece to the people who needed to hear it. Then he stood on the deck of the Missouri in his dress uniform and did his job. General Douglas MacArthur stepped to the table where the surrender documents were waiting. He was carrying 5 pens. He had planned this. The first went to General Jonathan Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines when MacArthur left the island in 1942, and who had spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp, and arrived at the ceremony so thin that his uniform hung off his shoulders. The second went to British General Arthur Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. 1 pen went to West Point, MacArthur's alma mater. 1 went to his wife. He kept the last one for himself. 5 pens, 5 destinations. Each one chosen in advance. Each one placed on a list that existed before MacArthur walked onto that deck. MacArthur spoke for 4 minutes. Then the Japanese delegation signed. Then it was Nimitz's turn. He had 1 pen, a green Parker fountain pen. He signed his name. A yeoman handed the pen back to him when he was done. He put it in his pocket and stepped back. A correspondent covering the ceremony wrote that evening that Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly it was easy to miss that he had been there at all. MacArthur's aircraft lifted off toward Tokyo. He had been named Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan. He would run the country from an office building in central Tokyo. Japanese soldiers, lining his motorcade routes with their backs, turned outward in a gesture of respect that the Imperial Army had once reserved for the Emperor alone. The Japanese would call him the blue-eyed shogun. That was not entirely a compliment. Nimitz's aircraft turned toward Pearl Harbor. He had a report to write. His final assessment of the Pacific War, several hundred pages covering every major campaign from December 1941 to August 1945. He named the decisions that had been correct, the operations that had succeeded, and why. He noted the failures without naming the individuals responsible for them. He submitted it to the Navy Department. It received no press coverage. He didn't mention that to anyone either. Back to Yokosuka, back to the Mikasa. The ship's history before 1945 is a story in itself. It had been built in England in 1899 at the Vickers Yard in Barrow-in-Furness, because Japan did not yet have the industrial capacity to build a pre-dreadnought battleship of that class. It had served as Togo's flagship through the Russo-Japanese War. A week after Tsushima, with the victory won, with the war effectively over, an accidental explosion and fire on board killed 250 of its crew and sent the ship to the bottom of Sasebo Harbor. It was raised, repaired, and went on to serve through World War I and in naval operations against Soviet forces in the Russian Civil War. In 1923, following the Washington Naval Treaty, it was decommissioned. The Japanese government arranged for it to be preserved as a memorial ship. Its hull encased in concrete at Yokosuka opened to the public in 1926 in the presence of Crown Prince Hirohito and the retired Admiral Togo. Then the Second War came, and then the occupation. By 1945, the Mikasa was in poor condition. American occupation soldiers had treated it the way soldiers often treat things that don't belong to them and that no one is guarding: clocks, fixtures, instruments. Anything that could be unscrewed or pried loose went into kit bags and duffel bags and home. The Soviet Union, as one of the Allied powers at the table, was pressing its demand that the ship be demolished entirely. For the Soviets, the Mikasa was not history, it was an insult. Tsushima had cost Russia more than 5,000 dead and the destruction of a fleet it had spent years assembling and 7 months sailing to the other side of the world. The concrete hull sitting in Yokosuka Harbor was a monument to that. They wanted it gone. Nimitz said no. He posted American guards on the ship, gave orders that no further looting was to occur, and made clear that the question of demolition was settled. The Soviets were not pleased. Nimitz was not especially concerned with whether the Soviets were pleased. What he was concerned with, though he did not put it in those terms, because he rarely put things in those terms, was that a ship was about to disappear because the wrong people wanted to make a point, and he was the man in the position to stop it from happening. So he stopped it. For a few years, the situation stabilized. The Mikasa sat in its concrete berth, guarded, deteriorating more slowly than it had been, but still deteriorating. In 1958, a group of Japanese preservationists, former military men, historians, people who believed the ship deserved a full restoration, formally organized a campaign. They needed money. They needed legitimacy. They needed someone whose name meant something in both countries. They wrote to Nimitz in California. He was 72 years old, retired, living quietly on Yerba Buena Island. He had no obligation to respond. He had no obligation to do anything with his retirement except live it. He wrote a check, his own money, the first American contribution to the Mikasa Restoration Fund, and he put his name to the effort publicly, which brought other American contributors behind him. The restoration took nearly 2 years. On May 27, 1961, the 56th anniversary of the Battle of Tsushima, the battle that the ship had led, the battle that had shaped what Japan became, and what the Pacific War eventually had to be fought to undo. The Mikasa reopened as a museum ship at Yokosuka. They placed a statue of Togo on the grounds beside it, the man who had stood on that bridge, the man whose face Nimitz had studied across a crowded garden 56 years before. The ship is still there today. It sits just outside the gates of Commander, Fleet Activities Yokosuka, the largest American naval installation in the Western Pacific, home port to the United States' 7th Fleet. The country that spent 4 years trying to sink the Imperial Japanese Navy now maintains its primary Western Pacific naval presence within sight of the ship's bridge. Every year on May 27th, the commander of United States Naval Forces Japan goes aboard the Mikasa for a memorial ceremony, alongside officers of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, 2 navies that spent 4 years trying to destroy each other, standing on the deck of a ship that one of them built and one of them helped save. Chester Nimitz arranged that outcome, not deliberately. He wasn't thinking about what ceremonies would look like in 60 years when he made that call in 1945. He was thinking about a ship and a decision, and what the right thing to do was. But the outcome is what it is, and it is standing in Yokosuka right now. Washington, D.C., the fall of 1945. The war was over, and the Navy needed to be managed. Budgets, personnel, post-war demobilization, the fundamental question of what the American military was supposed to look like, now that the two enemies that had defined it for 4 years had been defeated. President Truman nominated Nimitz to succeed Admiral King as Chief of Naval Operations. The Senate confirmed him. He took the job. He sat in meetings, budget hearings, congressional testimony, inter-service disputes about funding and roles, and who was going to fly what kind of aircraft off which kind of ship. The Army Air Forces were pressing to become their own branch. What would become the Air Force? And the question of how that reorganization would affect the Navy was playing out in committee rooms and staff papers, and the kind of institutional warfare that leaves no visible casualties and produces no discernible winners. The military was being cut. The country wanted its men home, its factories retooled. Its attention turned toward something other than the production of weapons. Nimitz had to manage the contraction of the largest naval force in human history, while simultaneously arguing in front of people who had already made up their minds that the Navy deserved to survive it intact. He told his wife Catherine that he hated Washington, not the city. He had lived there before, earlier in his career, and had managed. What he hated was the work, or rather what the work had become. At Pearl Harbor in 1942, sitting at his desk with the harbor, still black with oil from the ships that had burned on December 7th. Every decision he made had a direct consequence that he could trace. He could see what he had to work with. He could see what the enemy had. He could read the dispatches coming in from the submarines and the carriers and the shore installations, and understand what they meant in terms of real things. Ships, men, positions on a chart. The gap between where he was and where he needed to be. A wrong decision meant men died. A right one meant the enemy's ships went down instead of his. The weight of it was terrible, but it was honest. It was the weight of something real. In Washington, the wrong decision meant a budget line moved by 3%. The right decision meant a committee chairman felt respected enough to support a piece of legislation. The consequences were measured in things that could not be counted in any way that mattered to him. He had spent 4 years making decisions that determined whether young Americans lived or died. Now he was in rooms where the question was whether the Navy would get to keep a particular type of carrier-based aircraft or hand the mission to the Air Force. He stayed for 2 years because the job required it. And Nimitz was not a man who walked away from what the job required. He had never been that. But in December of 1947, as his 2-year term drew to a close, he stepped down as Chief of Naval Operations. No farewell dinner organized for the cameras. No book announced. No board memberships or consulting arrangements lined up. He handed the office to his successor, Admiral Louis Denfeld, said what needed to be said, and left the building. He flew back to California, to Yerba Buena Island, in the middle of San Francisco Bay, where the Navy maintained quarters, and where he had already been spending as much time as Washington would permit. He walked every morning. He tended a garden, he read. He was, by most accounts of the people around him in those years, genuinely at ease in a way that the previous decade had not allowed. He did not give speeches about what the war had meant. He did not write his memoirs. He lived on an island in the middle of a bay, close enough to the water to hear it, and let the years go by without requiring them to be anything other than what they were. There is a small town in the Texas Hill Country called Fredericksburg. It sits in Gillespie County, about an hour west of Austin. German immigrants settled it in the 1840s, and it kept that character. Quiet streets, old stone buildings, a landscape of live oaks and cedar that doesn't look like anywhere else in Texas. In 1944, the population was around 3,000 people. Chester Nimitz was born there in 1885. His grandfather had run a hotel on Main Street, the Nimitz Hotel, which locals called the Steamboat Hotel, because the old man had built it in the shape of a ship's prow, complete with a wooden bridge on top. The family had deep roots in the town. Chester grew up there, went to school there, and left at 16 to pursue an appointment to the Naval Academy. He did not go back often, but the town remembered him. After the war, a museum was established in his name, the Admiral Nimitz Museum, built around the old hotel his grandfather had run. It told the story of the Pacific War. It told the story of the man who had commanded it on the American side. And then, on May 8, 1976, something was dedicated on the grounds of that museum that had not been there before. A Japanese garden, not a small decorative feature. A full traditional Japanese garden, stone lanterns, a koi pond, carefully shaped plantings, the kind of space that takes years to design and build, and that requires a specific kind of attention to get right. The Japanese government had supported it. The Japanese people had contributed to it. It was built by Japanese craftsmen who came to Fredericksburg specifically for that purpose. They called it the Garden of Peace. It was a gift. The Japanese government had contributed. The Japanese people had contributed. Japanese craftsmen had traveled to Fredericksburg specifically to build it. Nimitz had died in February of 1966. He was 80 years old. He never saw it dedicated. He never knew it was coming. The ceremony took place on May 8, 1976, with American and Japanese officials present, with speeches and photographs, and all the formal weight that events like this carry. The man it honored had been dead for 10 years. His name was on the museum next door. His grandfather's old hotel, the one built to look like the bow of a ship, still stood on Main Street, the way it had since before Chester was born. The garden is still there today. Anyone who drives to Fredericksburg can walk through it. Here is what the record shows. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet from the last day of 1941 to the first day of September 1945. He oversaw the campaigns that pushed the Japanese Navy out of the Central Pacific, that cut Japan's supply lines, that brought American forces within bombing range of the home islands. When the war ended, he stood on the Missouri and signed his name, put the pen in his pocket, and got back to work. He did not need 5 pens. He did not need a title in Tokyo. He did not need to stand at a microphone and describe what the moment meant to civilization. When the Soviets wanted to destroy the flagship of Japan's greatest admiral, he said no. When a preservation committee in Japan needed someone to write the first check, he wrote it. When Washington wanted him to sit in budget hearings for the rest of his career, he resigned after 2 years and went home to walk by the water. And in a small town in the Texas Hill Country, on a piece of ground his family had known since before he was born, the people of Japan built him a garden that he never lived to see. There is a version of this story that is easy to misread. It is easy to look at what Nimitz did after the war. The guards on the Mikasa, the Restoration Fund, the quiet life on the island, and conclude that he was a gentle man, a forgiving man, a man who felt sorry for the Japanese and wanted to help them recover. That is not what the record shows. The record shows a man who sent submarines to cut off Japan's food and fuel supply, who oversaw campaigns that killed tens of thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers, who prosecuted 4 years of war with the sole objective of defeating an enemy as completely and quickly as possible. He was not gentle about any of it. He was not supposed to be. That was the job, and he did the job. What he was finished when it was finished. That is a different thing entirely. Some men need to keep the battlefield after the battle is over. They need to stand on it and point to where they stood. They need the flags and the ceremonies, and the bronze plaques, and the monuments in their own image. Nimitz came home from the biggest naval war in history, and the most visible thing he left behind in his own country was a museum in the Texas town where he was born. A museum about the war, not about himself. The most visible thing he left behind in Japan was a ship that belonged to the man he had first seen in a garden in Tokyo in the summer of 1905. An old admiral moving through a crowd, talking to young American officers like the conversation was worth having. Nimitz watched that. He was 20 years old. He was still thinking about it 50 years later, when he wrote the first check. If you had a father or a grandfather who served in the Pacific, on a ship, on a submarine, on a beach somewhere that doesn't appear in the history books, this is the moment. Put his name in the comments, the branch, the theater, whatever you know. Because the men in this story didn't fight for the monuments. They fought, so the people sitting where you're sitting right now would never have to. The least we can do is say their names out loud. Don't let them disappear. December 14th, 1943, a conference room at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz sits at the head of the table. To his right, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. Across from him, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. And beside Turner, Marine General Holland Smith. Three of the finest military minds the United States had produced. Three men who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Nimitz looks at each of them. Then he asks the question, "Gentlemen, what do you think?" Spruance answers first. "Too dangerous." Turner next. "Reckless." "Outright reckless." Holland Smith agrees. "Take the outer islands first. Watcha, Maluilap. Build your way in. Don't go straight at Kwajalein. Not yet." Three men. Three answers. All the same. Now here is the thing you need to understand about Chester Nimitz in that room. 3 weeks before that meeting, he had stood on a beach called Betio. Betio is a tiny island in Tarawa Atoll, 2 miles long, not even a quarter-mile wide. The kind of place you could drive across in 5 minutes. The Marines had taken it on November 20th, 76 hours of fighting. More than 1,000 Americans dead. When Nimitz landed on November 27th, the island had not yet buried all its dead. He walked the length of it anyway. Not a single coconut palm still standing. Men with shovels still working in the heat. The smell of something that had no name in polite language. He had been in the Navy for 30 years. Nothing had prepared him for this. Back at Pearl Harbor, the letters were already piling up on his desk. Hundreds of them. The same message over and over from mothers and fathers across every state in the country. "You killed my son on Tarawa." Nimitz read every one and wrote back to everyone. And now, 3 weeks after standing in that smell, he is sitting in a conference room at Pearl Harbor. His 3 best commanders have just told him, "Do not go straight at Kwajalein." And you have to wonder, what does a man like that do next? If you've never heard of the Battle of Kwajalein, that's not your fault. History tends to remember the battles that cost the most. This one was too successful to be famous. If you think this story deserves to be told, hit that like button. It helps more Americans find it. 2 months after that meeting, 36,000 artillery rounds would fall on a single island smaller than most commercial airports. A rear admiral would order a battleship so close to the enemy shore that his sailors could watch individual palm trees explode under 14-inch guns. And on a burning airfield, a 22-year-old Marine with a tattoo on his arm, 4 words, "Death before dishonor," would prove that it wasn't just a tattoo. This is the story of the man who said no to all 3 of his commanders. And because of that, thousands of young Americans came home. The Battle of Tarawa ended on November 23, 1943. 4 days later, Nimitz flew in. The airstrip on Betio had taken fire throughout the battle. The engineers were still patching it. The plane landed anyway. Nimitz stepped out onto an island that was almost unrecognizable as land. Betio before the battle, a flat strip of coral packed with concrete bunkers, coconut palms, Japanese gun emplacements, and nearly 5,000 men. Betio after, nothing standing above chest height, every tree gone, every structure collapsed or burned. The sand itself churned up and black in places from the weight of the bombardment. And beneath all of it, the dead. Nimitz walked the length of the island. He had spent 30 years in the Navy. He had seen the aftermath of battle before. Nothing prepared him for this. The men tasked with burying the dead had been working for 4 days. There were not enough of them. The island was only 2 miles long. There was nowhere to go that was far from the work they still had left to do. He didn't write much about what he saw. Some things resist language. But here is what Nimitz knew, standing on that beach, that no one sitting safely in Washington could fully understand. The men who died here did not die because they weren't brave enough. They died because the tide didn't come in. The assault plan called for 5 feet of water over the reef at H hour. That would have been enough for the Higgins boats, the flat-bottomed landing craft, to clear the coral and reach the beach. But November 20th, 1943, was one of the 2 days each year when a neap tide holds the water down. The reef sat 3 feet beneath the surface, maybe less. The boats scraped to a halt 800 yards from shore. 800 yards. The Marines climbed over the sides and waited. Chest-deep water, then waist-deep, then knee-deep, the entire way under fire. The landing craft that couldn't move, they sat there in the open water, taking Japanese machine gun fire until they sank or burned. 125 amphibious tractors, the tracked vehicles that could actually cross the reef, had been allocated for the assault. By the end of the first day, most of them were gone. The naval bombardment had lasted 3 hours. 3 hours, against bunkers built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete, built to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, built by men who had been fortifying this island for 2 years. The shells had hit. The bunkers hadn't cared. Tarawa was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of planning. And every man who died in that surf knew the difference, even if he couldn't say so. Nimitz came home from Betio and sat down at his desk. The letters were waiting. Hal Lamar, his aide, his gatekeeper, the man who managed everything that came in and out of the Admiral's office, had tried to set them aside. Lamar understood that Nimitz was carrying the entire Pacific War. He understood that the Admiral did not need, on top of everything else, to read letters from grieving mothers. Nimitz disagreed. He read them, everyone, hundreds of them, arriving every day, from small towns in Ohio, from farms in Georgia, from neighborhoods in Boston and Pittsburgh and San Diego, where young men had grown up playing baseball and then gone to the Pacific, and not come back. The letters did not mince words. "You killed my son. My boy is dead because of you." What was it for? Nimitz wrote back to every one of them. No form letter, no template. He sat down and he wrote. He told his wife, "I am just as distressed as can be." He prayed, he actually wrote the word prayed, for the war to end, to stop the killing, to stop the maiming. He visited the hospitals. He walked the wards. He sat beside the beds of men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost things that couldn't be named in a letter home. He stood beside the bed of a 19-year-old soldier who was dying. He told the young man he was proud of him, told him his country was proud of him. The soldier died with a smile on his face. Nimitz walked back out into the corridor, and the next morning he came back to his desk, and he made his decisions, Here is the thing no history book quite captures about what Chester Nimitz was facing. He knew Tarawa was right, not the way it was executed. That was wrong, and he knew it, and he would spend the next 2 months making sure it never happened that way again. But the decision to take Tarawa? That was right. You needed that airfield. You needed that base. You needed Tarawa to get to the Marshalls, and you needed the Marshalls to get to the Marianas, and you needed the Marianas to get B-29s within range of Tokyo. Every link in that chain was necessary. The question, the only question, was this: how do you keep fighting and lose fewer men doing it? How do you take the next island and bring more of them home? That was what Nimitz was working out, sitting at that desk, reading those letters, writing those answers back. Every decision he made from that point forward, every choice about where to strike, when to strike, how to strike, was shaped by what he had seen on Betio, not as a lesson learned in an after-action report, as something he had walked through, felt underfoot, carried home in his uniform. He was going to fix it. The photographs came back in late November. Reconnaissance planes had been running sorties over the Marshall Islands for weeks before the December meeting. High-altitude passes, low-altitude passes, every atoll in the chain, photographed and rephotographed. When the analysts finished their work, the maps went up on the wall at Pearl Harbor, and something unexpected stared back. The outer islands, Voja, Maloelap, Mili, Jaluit, were fortified exactly as expected. Airfields, coastal guns, reinforced defensive positions. Thousands of Japanese troops dug in and waiting. Kwajalein, the central atoll, the Japanese administrative headquarters in the Marshalls, the place they had held since before the war, was lighter, not undefended, not easy, but significantly weaker than what surrounded it. The reason, it turned out, was simple. Japanese commanders in the Marshalls had looked at the American pattern, the cautious, methodical island-hopping approach, and concluded that the United States would do what any sensible military force would do. Work from the outside in. Take the near islands first. Establish air bases. Reduce the risk. Then come for the center. So they had concentrated their strength on the outer ring. They were waiting for exactly the attack they expected, which meant that if Nimitz hit where they were not expecting, straight at the center, skipping the outer islands entirely, he would catch the strongest Japanese position in the Marshalls at its most vulnerable. It was the kind of intelligence that changes everything, or changes nothing, depending on who is reading it. Nimitz's senior planner, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, looked at those photographs and said, "It's feasible." His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, agreed. Feasible. Not safe. Not certain. Not without risk. Feasible. That was enough for Nimitz to call the December 14th meeting. He gathered Spruance, Turner, and Holland Smith. He laid out the intelligence. He explained what the photographs showed. And then he did something that was, in its own way, as revealing as anything he would say that day. He went around the room. He asked each man, individually, what he thought. Spruance first. "Raymond, what do you think?" Then Turner. Then Smith. He wanted to hear them out. Every objection. Every concern. Every reason it might go wrong. They did. Spruance laid out the strategic danger. Kwajalein sat deep inside Japanese-controlled waters. Enemy airfields on those outer islands would surround them on every side. Supply lines would be exposed. If something went wrong, if the landing stalled, if the Japanese reinforced faster than expected, there was no fallback position. Turner went further. The plan was dangerous, outright reckless. The outer islands had to be taken first. That was the proper military sequence. The Navy had done it that way for a reason. Holland Smith, who had argued before Tarawa that the whole Gilbert Islands campaign was misconceived, found himself on the same side as Turner. Take Voja and Malolap first. Build your air cover. Then move on Kwajalein. The three men finished. The room was quiet. No one had said anything Nimitz hadn't already considered. He had been sitting with these objections for 2 weeks, running them against the photographs, running them against the intelligence on Japanese dispositions, running them against every piece of information that had come across his desk since he walked off that airstrip on Betio. He looked around the table. Then he said it quietly. "Well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein." Most of the men in that room gathered their papers and left. Spruance and Turner stayed. Whatever decorum had governed the formal meeting, it was over now. The two admirals pressed their case directly. This plan was dangerous and reckless. They said those words to his face, the same words Turner had used at the table. Nimitz listened. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who ended arguments with rank. In 30 years of the Navy, the people who had worked closest to him had almost uniformly described him the same way: calm, approachable, genuinely open to being wrong. Rear Admiral Spruance, who knew him as well as anyone, would later say he admired Nimitz's intelligence above all else, and above that, what he called his utter fearlessness. But there is a difference between being open to being wrong and being willing to let someone else's fear make your decision. Nimitz let them finish. Then he said, "If you don't want to do it, I'll find someone who will." That was the end of it. Spruance and Turner walked out of the room. The decision had been made. What no one in that room could know, what no one could possibly know, is that the Japanese commander in the Marshals, Rear Admiral Masashi Kobayashi, had done exactly what Spruance and Turner predicted Nimitz would do. He had read the American pattern. He had moved his best troops and heaviest fortifications to Votja and Maloelap. He was ready for an attack that was not coming. There is something that never quite makes it into official histories about the kind of decision Nimitz made in that room. The histories will tell you he had good intelligence, that the photographs supported the plan, that the logic was sound. All of that is true. What the histories don't say as plainly is this: he didn't know, not for certain, not in the way you can be certain about a math problem or a set of verified facts. He had evidence, he had analysis, he had instinct built from 30 years of understanding how navies fight and how men break under fire. But between the evidence and the certainty, there was a gap. There is always a gap. Nimitz knew it was there. He crossed it anyway, because the alternative, the safe, sensible, methodical alternative that his 3 best commanders were begging him to take, meant more weeks of bombing outer islands, more weeks of Japanese engineers reinforcing Kwajalein, more weeks of young men crossing oceans toward a target that was getting harder to take with every day. He didn't move. He had read those letters. He was not going to create more of them out of an abundance of caution. On the voyage back from Tarawa, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner sat down at a table somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and started writing. He called the document Recommendations for Changes and Improvements in Tactics, Techniques, Existing Instructions, and Material. It was not a short document. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's own planning officer, Captain James Steele, put together a companion piece. He called his version something more direct. 100 mistakes made on Tarawa. 100. That document became the operating manual for everything that followed. Every man who died on Betio had, in some sense, contributed a line to that list. The tide calculation, written down. The bombardment timeline, written down. The landing craft specifications, written down. The communication failures between ships and shore, written down. The shortage of amphibious tractors, written down. The failure to scout the reef conditions in the final hours, written down. Everything that had gone wrong on November 20th, everything that had put Marines in chest-deep water 800 yards from a beach covered by machine guns, was now on paper, with a proposed fix beside it. By the time the fleet assembled for Kwajalein, 5 specific changes had been made that did not exist at Tarawa. First, the naval bombardment. At Betio, the ships had fired for 3 hours. They had fired from a distance considered safe, far enough back that the big guns could shell the island without putting the ships themselves in immediate danger. The shells had been high-explosive rounds. They had detonated on contact with the surface. Against open positions, open trenches, open ground, they were devastating. Against concrete bunkers, they were noise. For Kwajalein, the bombardment would run for 3 days, not 3 hours, 3 days, and it would use armor-piercing rounds, rounds designed not to explode on the surface, but to drive through it, to punch through reinforced concrete and detonate inside the structure that was supposed to protect the defenders. Second, the landing approach. At Betio, the assault came from the ocean side, the obvious side, the side the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying. For Kwajalein, every landing would come from the lagoon side. The Japanese had focused their heaviest defenses seaward. The lagoon approach was where the coral reefs were thinnest, the water deepest close to shore, the fortifications weakest. The Japanese had not believed American amphibious vehicles could cross the outer reef and attack from the lagoon. After Tarawa, they knew better, but the fortifications were already built. You can't move concrete gun emplacements in 6 weeks. Third, the preliminary seizure of small islands. Before the main assault on Kwajalein Island and Roy Namur, American forces would land on the smaller islets surrounding the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, tiny pieces of coral, barely wide enough for a man to stand on in some places, but wide enough to set up artillery. By the night before the main assault, Army howitzers on Carlson Island had registered their guns on Kwajalein Island. Marine artillery on captured islets had zeroed in on Roy Namur. Every major target would be hit from land and sea simultaneously. Fourth, the underwater demolition teams. After Tarawa, Rear Admiral Turner had ordered the formation of 9 underwater demolition teams, what the Navy would eventually call the UDTs. These were the men who swam in ahead of the landing craft. In daylight sometimes, under fire sometimes. They mapped the reef. They marked the channels. They identified and destroyed obstacles. They made sure the men coming in behind them would not find out about a problem by running into it in the dark. Fifth, the landing craft themselves. The LVTs, the amphibious tractors, had been modified, reinforced, redesigned. More of them, better armored, better armed. Enough to carry the first waves across the reef regardless of what the tide was doing on any given morning. 5 changes, none of them genius, all of them bought with the lives of the men who died at Tarawa. But there was one man at Kwajalein who took all 5 of those lessons and added something of his own. Rear Admiral Richard Lansing Connolly. He commanded the Northern Attack Force, the ships and Marines tasked with taking Roy and Namur, the twin islands at the north end of the atoll. Connolly was not a flashy commander. He was not famous. He was not the kind of admiral whose name ended up in newspaper headlines. He was an engineer's mind in an admiral's uniform. And he had a belief, simple, almost blunt, that he had been working toward for most of his career. You cannot destroy a fortified position by lobbing shells at it from a comfortable distance. A shell fired from 2 miles away arrives at an angle. It hits the roof of a bunker, or the side, or the ground in front of it. Some percentage of the time, it does real damage. The rest of the time, it does nothing the defenders can't walk away from. A shell fired from close range arrives nearly flat. It hits the face of the bunker directly. It has enough velocity to drive through the wall, not just rattle it. If you want to destroy a hardened position, really destroy it, not just inconvenience it, you have to get close. This is what Connolly believed. And on the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, he decided to prove it. At 12 minutes past noon, Rear Admiral Connolly sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. The signal read, "Desire Maryland move in really close this afternoon for counter-battery and counter-blockhouse fire, using pointer fire for both main and secondary batteries. Move in really close." That phrase, in a Navy that ran on precise technical language, operational codes, standardized communications, stood out like a man speaking plainly in a room full of formal speeches. Move in really close, not advance to coordinates, not reduce range to optimum firing distance, close. Maryland moved, so did Mississippi. USS Mississippi pulled to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese shore. 1,500 yards, a little under a mile. Within easy range of the Japanese coastal defense guns on Roy Namur. Within the effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery, repurposed for shore defense. The Japanese gunners could see the ship. The ship's crew could see the shore. They could watch, through their gun sights, individual coconut palms disintegrate as the 14-inch shells hit them at nearly point-blank range. The bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional naval bombardment began to come apart. The Japanese defenders who had been sheltering inside them were no longer being rattled by near misses. They were being hit. From that afternoon forward, Richard Connolly had a nickname that would follow him for the rest of the war and the rest of his life. Close-in Connolly. He had put his ships in danger to save his Marines. That is not a complicated calculation, in principle. Every commander understands the trade-off in the abstract. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually do it. To order your own ships into the range of enemy guns because you believe, down to your bones, that the men on the beach are worth more than the risk to your hull. Connolly believed it, and he proved it. The landings began before dawn. January 31st, 1944. Rubber boats in the dark. Army soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division sliding over the sides of their ships and paddling quietly toward 4 small islands at the southern end of the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, tiny pieces of land, the largest of them not much bigger than a city block, lightly defended. Most of the Japanese on them were support personnel, communications men, aviation ground crew, men who had never expected to be in a ground battle. By nightfall, the islands were American. The 145th Field Artillery Battalion had its howitzers on Carlson Island before midnight. Gun crews working by flashlight, registering their weapons on targets across the water. Kwajalein Island, the main Japanese base in the south, was within range. 45 miles to the north, Marines from the 25th Regiment had done the same. 5 more small islands, 5 more artillery platforms. Roy Namur was zeroed in. On the morning of February 1st, the bombardment that had been running for 3 days was joined by everything that had been waiting in reserve. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, land-based artillery from the captured islets, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58. On Kwajalein Island in the south, 7,000 naval rounds fell on the Japanese garrison in a single day. The artillery on Carlson added 29,000 more, 36,000 shells, on an island 2.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide. The Japanese had built their defenses expecting to hold the beaches. They had built their strongest positions facing the ocean, the deep water, the obvious approach. They had not built for this. At the northern end of the atoll, on Roy Island, the Marines went ashore from the lagoon side at 11:45 in the morning. The first wave crossed the reef in their LVTs, then the second wave, then the third. The defenders who came out of the bunkers were not the men who had gone in. 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of Connolly's ships firing from 1,500 yards had done something to the Japanese garrison on Roy that the planners had not quite dared to count on. It had broken them, not their will exactly. The Japanese soldiers who emerged from the shattered concrete were still armed. Some of them still fought, but they came out dazed, disoriented, blinking into the smoke and the light like men who had been underground for a week. The Marines moved across the airfield. At 6 o'clock in the evening, 7 hours after the first wave hit the beach, the 23rd Marines declared Roy secure. 3,500 Japanese defenders, 1 island, 7 hours. At Tarawa, Betio had taken 76. But the story of February 1st on Roy is not just about what the bombardment did. It is about one man who was not supposed to be there at all. Private First Class Richard Beatty Anderson, born June 26, 1921, Tacoma, Washington. He grew up in Agnew, a small community on the Olympic Peninsula, the kind of place where everybody knew your name and the nearest city was an hour away. He graduated from Sequim High School. On July 6, 1942, 7 months after Pearl Harbor, he walked into a recruiting office in Oakland, California, and enlisted in the Marine Corps. He was 21 years old. He joined Company E, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division. On his arm he had a tattoo. 4 words: death before dishonor. He shipped out for the Central Pacific in January 1944. On the morning of February 1st, 1944, Richard Anderson was a mortar man. His job was in the rear, with his weapon, with his crew, providing indirect fire support for the infantry moving ahead of him. For reasons that no one who was there was ever able to fully explain, Anderson was not with his mortar crew that afternoon. He was at the front, moving across the airfield on Roy Island with the rifle companies. In the middle of a battle, in the middle of a burning airfield, carrying a box of grenades. The airfield on Roy had been cratered by 3 days of naval gunfire. Large craters, deep enough that a man could drop into one and disappear from sight. They offered cover. In the middle of the afternoon, Anderson spotted one of those craters ahead of him. He dropped into it. 3 other Marines were already inside. Anderson reached into his box, pulled out a grenade, pulled the pin, stepped up to throw. The grenade slipped. It happened in a fraction of a second. The kind of thing that happens to hands that are tired, or sweating, or shaking, or all 3 in the middle of a battle, in the heat of a Pacific Island afternoon. The grenade fell, down into the bottom of the crater. 4 men inside. No time to pick it up and throw it clear. No time to climb out. No time for anything except the one decision that Richard Anderson made in whatever fragment of a second he had. He threw himself on it. He took the full force of the explosion. He was pulled out of the crater and carried back. Evacuated to the USS Callaway, a transport ship anchored in the lagoon. He died that day. February 1st, 1944. He was 22 years old. He was buried at sea, with full military honors, somewhere in the waters off Roy Namur. The 3 men in that crater with him walked off the island alive. On August 17, 1944, 6 months and 16 days after Richard Anderson died, a ceremony was held at the Naval Station at Pier 91 in Seattle. His mother, Mrs. Oscar Anderson, stood at the front. She accepted the Medal of Honor on behalf of her son. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Private First Class." Anderson fearlessly chose to sacrifice himself and save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade and taking the full impact of the explosion. He gallantly gave his life for his country. His mother held the medal. She had raised a boy who had gone to a recruiting office 7 months after his country was attacked, who had tattooed 4 words on his arm, who had ended up, for reasons no one could explain, at the front of a battle on an island most Americans would never hear of, and who, when the moment came, the moment nobody plans for, nobody trains for, the moment that simply arrives, had not hesitated. The following July, a destroyer was launched at the Todd Pacific shipyards in Seattle. On July 7, 1945, a year and 5 months after her son died, Mrs. Oscar Anderson was back at that waterfront, this time to christen the ship that would carry his name. USS Richard B. Anderson, DD 786. She would serve for 30 years. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. 3 decades of the Navy carrying the name of a 22-year-old mortarman from Agnew, Washington, into waters his son never got to see. Richard Anderson did not know Chester Nimitz. He did not know that 2 months earlier, an admiral had sat in a conference room and overruled 3 of the finest military commanders in America because he had decided he was not going to waste a single life he could save. He did not know Richard Connolly. He did not know about the battleships that had moved to 1,500 yards so that the bunkers on his airfield would be broken before he set foot on it. He did not know any of it. He was a kid from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula who was in the wrong place at the right moment. But here is what connects them. Nimitz read those letters because he could not look away from what his decisions cost other people. Connolly moved his ships closer because he could not accept a version of success that wasted lives he could have saved. Anderson threw himself on that grenade because he could not let 3 men die if there was anything left in him to stop it. 3 different men. 3 different ranks. 3 different versions of the same refusal to let the people beside them pay a price they could absorb instead. None of them knew the others. All of them were there on February 1st, 1944. The battle for Kwajalein Island itself, the main Japanese base in the south, was harder than Roy. The 7th Infantry Division fought for 4 days, building by building, bunker by bunker. The Japanese garrison did not surrender. They fought until they were dead. It was declared secure on February 4th. When the final accounting was done across the entire atoll, Kwajalein Island in the south, Roinamer in the north, the 30 smaller islets taken in between, the numbers looked like this: Japanese dead, more than 8,000. Japanese captured, a few hundred, most of them Korean laborers who had been brought to the islands by force and had no particular interest in dying for the emperor. Americans killed, 372. 372 men. Across an operation involving 85,000 troops and more than 300 warships, on a target defended by 8,000 Japanese soldiers. Now hold those numbers next to Tarawa. Tarawa, Betio Island, 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide. 4,500 Japanese defenders. Americans killed, more than 1,000. Kwajalein Atoll, 8,000 defenders, more than twice the size. Americans killed, 372, less than a third. The military planners had estimated, based on everything they knew, based on the precedent of Tarawa, based on the density of Japanese fortifications, that Kwajalein would take longer and cost more. They were wrong in the best possible way. Nimitz had expected the operation to take until mid-February. Kwajalein Island fell on February 4th. Roinamer had fallen on February 2nd. He was weeks ahead of schedule. On February 5th, Nimitz flew in. He had done this before, landed on a newly taken island before the engineers had finished clearing it. He walked the ground. In the days that followed, as prisoner interrogations came back, a picture emerged of what was waiting at Eniwetok, the next major atoll in the chain, 400 miles to the northwest. The Japanese garrison there was smaller than expected, the fortifications less developed. The window to hit it before they could be reinforced was open right now. Nimitz did not call another meeting. He did not ask his commanders to form a committee. He called Spruance, the same man who had told him 2 months earlier that going straight to Kwajalein was dangerous and reckless. He told Spruance to take Eniwetok immediately, with the reserves that had not been used at Kwajalein. The operation that had been scheduled for May would happen in February instead, 3 months ahead of schedule. Spruance said yes. He did not argue. He did not say, "You were right, and I was wrong." He didn't have to. He just executed the order. Eniwetok fell by February 21st. When the war ended, when the last signatures were put on the documents on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the name Kwajalein didn't appear prominently in the headlines. It didn't appear in most of the headlines at all. Tarawa was famous. Iwo Jima was famous. Peleliu and Guadalcanal and Okinawa, battles that had cost thousands of American lives, were part of the national memory. Kwajalein was not. And in a strange way, that absence tells you everything. History is drawn to the places where the most was lost, where the price was highest, where the photographs were most devastating, where the casualty lists ran longest, where the families back home had the most grief to hold. Kwajalein was won too cleanly to make that kind of history. Kwajalein is the battle that history forgot, because it went right. But the men who did not come home from it, they were not an abstraction. They were somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. They were boys from Tacoma and Georgia and Ohio who had grown up in the years between the wars, during the Depression, in a country that was still figuring out what it was and what it owed the world. They had answered a question that none of them had wanted to be asked. And on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans cannot place on a map, they had done what was asked of them. There is one more thing worth saying. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, if your father was one of the young men who shipped out from San Diego or San Francisco in the first years after Pearl Harbor, there is a chance he was at Kwajalein, or on a ship in that lagoon, or on one of the escort carriers circling overhead, or on one of the transport ships standing off the atoll while the guns fired and the smoke rose and the men on the beach moved forward. He may never have told you about it. The men of that generation did not, as a rule, tell. Not because there was nothing to say, because some things happened at a level below language, below the kind of words that work at a dinner table or in a living room on a Sunday afternoon with grandchildren in the room. Some things they carried quietly. Not as a burden, necessarily. Just as weight. The ordinary weight of having been somewhere and seen something that changed the way the world looked afterward. There are stories that exist only in the memories of the people who were there. Stories that were never written down, never recorded, never told to anyone except maybe a wife, late at night, or a buddy from the same unit at a reunion years later. Stories that will disappear when the last people who carry them are gone. If you have one of those stories, if you heard something at a dinner table, or in a car on a long drive, or in the last years of someone's life when they finally started to talk, leave it in the comments. Write down what you remember, even if it's only a fragment, even if you don't know all the names or all the places. Write it down, because those men deserve to be remembered by the full weight of what they did, not just by the battles that made the front pages, but by the ones that didn't, by Kwajalein, by the names no headline carried but their families never lost. August 1943, Pearl Harbor Naval Base. Chester Nimitz picks up a phone. He does not call Washington. He does not request another meeting with the Bureau of Ordnance. He does not dictate another letter into the same silence that has swallowed every letter before it. He calls the submarine base. He tells them to load torpedoes into a boat, take it out to Kahulawe Island, and fire them into the underwater cliff face. Not at a Japanese ship, into rock, so they can pull the duds off the ocean floor, bring them back to a workbench at Pearl Harbor, and cut them open. The answer comes back from the machine shop. It is the firing pin, at a perfect 90-degree impact, the textbook shot, the one every American submarine commander spent years learning to execute. The spring collapses under the force of the blow. The pin cannot travel fast enough to strike the primer. The detonator does not fire. The better the shot, the more likely the dud. This test happens in August 1943, 21 months after the first American submarines fired their first torpedoes of the war. 21 months of submarine commanders filing the same report up the chain of command. The torpedoes are not working. 21 months of the Bureau of Ordnance, the men who designed the weapon, certified it and sent it to sea, sending back the same answer every time. The fault is with the crews, not the torpedo, the men. Nimitz had read every one of those reports. He had been one of those men, inside those boats, in those waters, before most of the officers now filing those reports had finished school. And for 21 months, he had pushed the system in every way available to him, and gotten partial answers to a problem that kept putting sailors on the bottom and letting Japanese ships go. So he fired the torpedoes into the cliff. What he found, and what he did with it, is a story that does not appear in most history books. Not because it isn't important, because it went right. And history, as a rule, remembers the things that went wrong. If this is the kind of story you think more Americans should find, hit the like button. It costs you nothing. It tells the algorithm this history is worth putting in front of people. And then stay with me. Because what comes next is the part nobody talks about. July 7th, 1908. Batangas Harbor, the Philippines. Ensign Chester Nimitz runs the destroyer USS Decatur aground on a mud bank. He had not checked the tide tables. The ship sits on the bottom overnight. A small steamer pulls her free the next morning. No one is killed. The damage is minor. The Navy convenes a court-martial. Nimitz is found guilty of neglect of duty. He receives a letter of reprimand. At 23 years old, his career is already carrying a weight that most young officers never have to lift. Washington sends him to submarines. In 1908, that is not where the Navy sends its rising stars. The boats are called pig boats, cramped, loud reeking of gasoline fumes in sealed metal hulls. They run on engines that demand constant attention and reward inattention with casualties. They dive to depths that compress the hull in ways you can hear. The officers who command them are not, as a rule, the officers the Navy is grooming for Admiral. Assignment to submarine duty is where the Navy parks officers it isn't sure what to do with. Nimitz accepts the assignment without a word of complaint. In January 1909, he reports to the 1st Submarine Flotilla. By May, he has command of USS Plunger, a boat so primitive the crew sometimes breathes fumes when the engine floods the hull. He does not treat it as a punishment. He treats it as an education. He studies the machinery until he understands it better than the men who built it. He converts his boats from gasoline engines to diesel, cleaner, more reliable, less likely to kill his crew with fumes or fire. He writes papers on submarine tactics that the Naval War College files and largely ignores. In 1912, he stands before the officers at the Naval War College and gives a lecture on submarine warfare. Most of those officers consider submarine warfare a curiosity at best, a distraction from the real Navy, the battleships, the gun lines, the fleet engagements that naval doctrine has been built around for 100 years. Nimitz is not confused about what submarines can do. He has spent 3 years inside them. He has watched what happens when a boat can move unseen beneath the surface, fire, and disappear before anyone above the waterline knows where the shot came from. He understands something that will not become obvious to the rest of the Navy for another 30 years. An empire that depends on shipping, on oil and ore and food and steel moving across thousands of miles of open ocean, has a throat, and submarines are the hand that closes around it. December 31, 1941. Pearl Harbor, 8 in the morning. The change of command ceremony for Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet does not take place on the deck of a battleship, because there is no undamaged battleship available at Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona is 27 feet below the surface of the harbor. The Oklahoma has capsized and has not been righted. The West Virginia, the California, the Nevada, all sunk or beached in the 24 hours that ended Sunday morning, December 7th. The ceremony takes place on the deck of USS Grayling, a submarine, SS-209. Nimitz later told people he assumed command aboard a submarine because the Japanese attack had left no other deck available. That may be true. He steps off the launch onto the dock. The harbor is still black with oil, not metaphorically, but literally. The fuel from the ships that burned in the first hours of December 7th has spread across the surface and sits there, thick and dark, between the sunken hulls. The officers waiting on the dock are not smiling. They know what the fleet looks like now. They know what is left. 3 carriers at sea, a handful of cruisers, a submarine force that has not yet fired a single torpedo in anger against the Navy that did this. Nimitz looks at the wreckage. He looks at the Arizona where she went down. He looks at the Oklahoma, her hull still showing above the waterline, men still somewhere inside her. He flipped a long time. Then he turns to his staff. "Get to work," he says. He does not go to the battleships first. Does not walk the airfields. Does not tour the command bunkers, or the fuel depots, or the dry docks, still working around the clock to pull ships off the bottom. He goes to the submarine base. He walks through the boats the way a man walks through a house he grew up in, with a knowledge that is in the hands and the feet, not just the head. He knows every sound these hulls make. He knows what the gauges mean when they read wrong. He knows the smell of a boat that is ready and the smell of one that is not. The officer accompanying him has spent his career on surface ships. He watches the new commander-in-chief move through the submarine and understands without being told that this man has been here before. On December 7th, 1941, the same day the bombs fell, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark had issued the order for unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Every Japanese vessel on the Pacific Ocean was a legitimate target. No warning required. Nimitz inherits that order. He makes it the spine of everything he does. The submarines go to sea. The first patrol reports come back within weeks, and they all say the same thing. The torpedoes are not working. There is a phrase the United States Navy uses. 4 words. Overdue and presumed lost. It appears on a standard form, a bureaucratic phrase, clean and precise, designed to describe a specific administrative condition. A submarine departs on patrol. It does not return. Radio contact is attempted. No response. More attempts, still nothing. Enough days pass that silence becomes its own answer. The boat is gone. The men are gone. Nobody knows exactly where. Nobody knows exactly when. Nobody knows what the last hour looked like. Chester Nimitz signed those forms. He did not have an aide initial on his behalf. He did not delegate the paperwork to a subordinate and move on. He signed them because he knew, in a way that most of the men who held his rank did not know, could not know, exactly what those 4 words described from the inside. He had been below periscope depth. He had heard the sounds a pressure hull makes when it goes deep. The creak of metal under compression, the way the frame settles, the small adjustments of a boat finding its trim in cold water. He had stood in a control room when the boat went quiet, and every man stopped what he was doing and watched the gauges and waited, waiting to find out whether the next sound would be water coming in or the signal to surface. He knew that silence. He had lived in it. And 30 years later, sitting at a desk at Pearl Harbor, reading a form that said a boat and its crew would not be coming back. He knew precisely what that silence looked like at its end. February 11, 1943. USS Grampus SS-207 departs Brisbane, War Patrol. She is not a green boat. She has been out 5 times already. She has sunk Japanese shipping. She has survived depth charge attacks. Her crew of 71 men knows the work. Somewhere in the waters near the Solomon Islands, she disappears. No distress call, no survivors, no wreckage ever found. On March 22, 1943, after radio messages go unanswered for weeks, the Navy lists USS Grampus as overdue and presumed lost with all hands. All hands. 71 men. Nimitz signs the form. He does not know if they were sunk by a Japanese destroyer. He does not know if it was depth charges, or a mine, or something mechanical that failed in a water nobody could reach. What he knows is the number, 71, and he knows that on every one of the patrols USS Grampus ran, every dive, every approach, every shot taken through a periscope. Her crew carried the Mark 14 torpedo. Grampus is not the exception. In 1942 alone, the Pacific Submarine Force loses 7 boats. 7 times Nimitz signs the form. Some of them are sunk by Japanese destroyers. Some by depth charges in waters they were ordered into. Some vanish without a witness to record what happened in the final hours. And on every patrol every one of those crews ran. They carried the same weapon. In all of 1942, American submarines fire 1,442 torpedoes across the Pacific. Post-war analysis of Japanese records, the actual accounting done after the war ended, from Japanese documents, of what Japanese ships actually went down, finds 109 ships sunk, 109 ships, from 1,442 torpedoes. In a war being run at Nimitz's direction as a campaign to cut the supply lines that kept Japan alive. Nimitz reads those numbers. He also reads the Bureau of Ordnance's response to every complaint, filed through proper channels by submarine commanders who came back from patrol and put the evidence in writing. The Bureau's answer does not change. Not after the first complaint, not after the 10th, not after the 100th. The fault lies with the crews, not the torpedo, the men. He is a former submariner, reading a report that tells him the men in those boats are the problem. He had been one of those men. He had trained alongside them. He had worked the same machinery, run the same approaches, lived in the same sealed world below the surface. He knew what those men were. He knows what that answer is worth. He does not say publicly what he thinks of it. There is a particular kind of weight, and not yet having the proof that forces it to stop. Nimitz carries that weight to his desk every morning. Some mornings there is a new form waiting. He signs it, and he goes to work. Spring 1942. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood is commanding submarines in the Southwest Pacific, based in Fremantle, Australia. His commanders are telling him the torpedoes run too deep. He asks the Bureau of Ordnance to investigate. The Bureau says the torpedo runs exactly where it is set. Lockwood decides to find out for himself. What he does next costs a career if it goes wrong. He commissions his own test, without Bureau of Ordnance approval, without authorization from Washington. June 20, 1942. King George Sound, Southern Australia. A fishnet is strung below the surface at a measured depth. USS Skipjack fires Mark 14 torpedoes set to run at 10 feet. The holes in the net are at 25 feet, not 10 feet, 25. Lockwood reports his findings to the Bureau of Ordnance. The Bureau disagrees. He repeats the test. Same result. He reports that the Mark 14 is running 11 feet deeper than its depth setting, and formally requests that the Bureau conduct its own equivalent tests. The Bureau resists. Lockwood takes his findings to Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington. the man above every admiral in the United States Navy. King, in the words of one historian, lit a blowtorch under the Bureau of Ordnance. August 1, 1942, the Bureau of Ordnance officially concedes. The Mark 14 runs deep. Its depth control mechanism was, in their own words, here is what had happened. During a warhead redesign years before the war, engineers had moved the torpedo's pressure sensor, the device that measured depth and controlled the weapon's course, from the nose to a position near the tail. At the tail, as the torpedo moved through the water at speed, the sensor sat inside a pocket of reduced pressure created by the weapon's own movement. That pocket told the sensor the torpedo was running shallower than it actually was. So, the guidance mechanism automatically drove the weapon deeper. A torpedo set to run at 15 feet was passing beneath its target at 25 to 26 feet. By this point in the war, more than 800 Mark 14 torpedoes have already been fired in the Pacific. The fix, a corrected pressure mechanism, is ordered. Nimitz watches the numbers. They improve. They do not change enough. The Mark 14 torpedo carries two separate detonation systems. The first is contact. The torpedo strikes the hull. The impact triggers the detonator. The warhead explodes. The second is magnetic. It is called the Mark 6 exploder. It works like this. As the torpedo passes beneath a steel ship, it senses the change in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the mass of metal above it. At the right moment, it fires. The warhead detonates not against the hull, but beneath the keel. A hull explosion tears a hole in the side of a ship. A keel explosion breaks the spine. Ships hit beneath the keel don't flood. They break in half and go down in minutes. In theory, the Mark 6 is the most devastating torpedo detonator any Navy has ever put to sea. In practice, in the Pacific, at tropical latitudes thousands of miles from the magnetic poles, the Earth's magnetic field is weaker than the conditions the Mark 6 was calibrated for. The mechanism fires early, a premature explosion in open water, far from the hull, loud enough to warn every destroyer within 5 miles, accomplishing nothing. Or it does not fire at all. Submarine commanders have already begun disabling the magnetic feature themselves. Without orders, without telling anyone above them in the chain of command, they reason correctly that a contact hit that has a chance of working is worth more than a magnetic detonation that will almost certainly not. The first submarine commander to do this was Captain Tyrrell Jacobs of USS Sargo, on the first war patrol of the entire Pacific War in December 1941. He disabled the Mark 6 on his own authority. He got into, as Navy records put it, considerable difficulty for doing so. The men who went around the system were punished for being right. By 1943, what had been an unofficial practice has spread across the submarine force. Nimitz finds out. He does not discipline the commanders who went outside proper procedure. He reads their patrol reports. He understands their reasoning. On June 24, 1943, as SINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief of the entire Pacific Fleet, Nimitz issues a direct order: deactivate all magnetic exploders on all Pacific Fleet submarines. The Bureau of Ordnance sends a response. It asks why. Nimitz replies in one sentence. His decision is final. The Bureau notes its disagreement on the record. The order stands. And still, the duds continue. 2 defects, 2 fixes, 20 months of war. And every week, submarines depart Pearl Harbor carrying weapons that may or may not fire. And every few weeks, one of them does not come back. Nimitz is not the kind of man who slams his fist on the table. He is not the kind of man who fires off angry cables to Washington, or calls press conferences to publicly humiliate the Bureau of Ordnance. He has been doing this the right way, through proper channels, with documented evidence, building a record that no one in Washington can dismiss. And the right way has given him 2 partial fixes and a war that is still being fought with a weapon he cannot fully trust. July 24, 1943. USS Tinosa, Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit is at the periscope. In the crosshairs, the Tanan Maru No. 3, Japanese fleet tanker, 19,000 tons. One of the largest tankers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. No escort. Not zigzagging. Making 13 knots in open water, loaded with fuel moving from Palau to truck. Tinosa had been alerted to the tanker's position by codebreakers. Daspit has been running toward her since before dawn. He closes to firing range, sets up the approach, runs the calculations. He fires his first spread of 4 torpedoes. The sonarman hears them running true. 4 hits, 0 explosions. The tanker turns away and increases speed. Daspit turns in pursuit. A nighttime chase. Hours of maneuvering. By the time he gets back into position, it is the following morning. This time coming at the tanker from the starboard quarter, an awkward angle, not textbook. He fires 2 torpedoes, both hit, both explode. The Tonan Maru takes the hits in the engine room. She coasts to a stop. She settles by the stern. She is not sinking. Daspit now has her exactly where every submarine commander trains for. A stationary target. Point-blank range. Perfect attack position. 90 degrees off the beam. He fires 1 torpedo. He moves Tinosa to the other side, repositions, fires again. Silence. Again. Silence. Between each shot, his torpedo men pull the next weapon from the rack and inspect it end to end. Every torpedo declared in perfect working order before it enters the tube. Daspit fires. The torpedo runs straight. The soundman calls the track as normal. The impact is clean. Silence, he fires again. Silence, he fires again. The torpedo hits the hull, glances off to the right, jumps clear of the water 100 feet from the tanker's stern. And Daspit writes in his log, "I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this." He fires again. Silence. He fires again. Silence. A destroyer appears on the horizon bearing toward them. Daspit fires 2 more stern shots as Tinosa dives. Both hit. Neither explodes. 15 torpedoes. 13 hits. 2 explosions, both fired at awkward angles during the nighttime chase, before he had the perfect position. Every torpedo fired from the ideal angle. Silence. 1 torpedo remains in Tinosa's racks. Daspit does not fire it. He orders the torpedo secured. He orders Tinosa to turn around. He sets a course for Pearl Harbor, 2,400 miles away. He is not returning to rearm. He is returning with something no submarine commander has ever brought back before. A torpedo that hit its target and did not explode, and a patrol report documenting 13 hits and 11 detonation failures. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood is at Pearl Harbor when Tinosa arrives. He goes to the dock. He expects to see a man in a rage. 19,000-ton tankers, he later writes, do not grow on trees. Daspit is almost silent. He hands Lockwood the patrol report and says almost nothing. The last torpedo, the one brought back from the Philippine Sea, is taken to the torpedo shop at the submarine base and completely disassembled by the base technicians. Their finding, it is in perfect working order. A torpedo the shop certifies as combat ready. A patrol report documenting 13 hits and 11 detonation failures. The gap between those 2 facts is this question the Bureau of Ordnance has never answered, because they have never asked it. The Mark 14 torpedo entered production in 1930. The Great Depression had gutted the Navy's development budget. The engineers who built it could not afford to fire live weapons at actual targets. Every test before the war used reduced-speed runs, practice warheads, controlled conditions designed to protect expensive equipment, not to simulate what happens when 3,000 pounds of torpedo, traveling at 46 knots, strikes a steel hull head-on. No live-fire test, not one. not in 13 years of production. Nobody had looked. Lockwood calls in Commander Charles Momsen. His suggestion is simple. Take torpedoes out to Kahulawe Island. Fire them at the underwater cliff face at full speed. Whatever doesn't explode, send divers down to recover. Bring the duds back to the torpedo shop. Cut them open. Find out what happens at the moment of impact. Lockwood agrees. Nimitz approves. USS Muskellunge is assigned to the test. August 31, 1943. Kahulawe Island, Hawaii. Muskellunge positions off the cliff face. The first torpedoes are fired. Some explode, some do not. Divers go down. They bring up the duds. Simultaneously, at the submarine's ace torpedo shop, a second test is running. Torpedoes loaded with dummy warheads are dropped from a crane 90 feet above a steel plate. A height chosen because the velocity at impact matches the torpedo's running speed of 46 knots. The plate is set at different angles. When it is perpendicular to the drop, a perfect 90-degree impact, the textbook shot, the attack position every submarine commander trains for, 70% of the exploders fail to fire. 70%. The results from the cliff test confirm it. The answer is in the firing pin. When the torpedo strikes a hull head-on at full speed, the deceleration force is greater than the firing pin mechanism was designed to absorb. The guide rods that direct the pin toward the primer distort under the impact load. The pin cannot travel far enough, fast enough, to strike the cap with sufficient force. The detonator does not fire. And here is what the test confirms about every patrol report. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent 21 months dismissing. The 2 torpedoes Daspit fired during the nighttime chase, the 2 that exploded, were fired at oblique angles under pressure, not quite the textbook position. Imperfect impacts, those detonated. Every subsequent torpedo fired from the ideal position at perfect 90-degree right angles, after the tanker was dead in the water and Daspit had all the time he needed, did not. The better the shot, the more likely the dud. For 21 months, every submarine commander who came back from patrol and reported that his torpedoes had hit their targets and failed to detonate had been filing, without knowing it, proof of exactly this. The fix does not come from the Bureau of Ordnance. No team of engineers arrives from Washington. No project is launched with Navy Department resources. No official program is funded or announced. The torpedo shop at Pearl Harbor Naval Submarine Base redesigns the firing pin. The steel firing pin blocks are replaced with aluminum alloy. Lighter, stronger under impact, fast enough to strike the primer before the force of the blow can distort the mechanism. The aluminum comes partly from Japanese aircraft shot down over Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Metal salvaged from the wreckage of the attack, melted down, recast, machined into the component that finally makes the weapon work. The metal from the planes that started the war goes into the torpedo that helps end it. Lockwood inspects every rebuilt explosive before it is installed in a weapon. He will not send another submarine to sea with a torpedo he has not personally verified. September 1943. 21 months after USS Sargo fired 13 torpedoes on her first war patrol and watched every one of them fail. American submarines leave Pearl Harbor with torpedoes that work. What happens in the next 18 months is what Nimitz had bet everything on from the first week. Finally, actually happening. American submarines sink more than 1,100 Japanese merchant ships in the final 18 months of the war. Japan's oil imports to the home islands collapse from 1.75 million barrels per month to near zero by late 1944. Japanese pilots complete their flight training. They sit on airfields across the Western Pacific. They cannot fly. There is no aviation fuel. Japanese warships are finished in the yards at Korea. They sit at anchor in harbor. There is no oil to put in their engines. The factories are producing artillery shells and aircraft parts, slow and slow again. The raw materials that fed them no longer arriving. The freighters carrying them no longer crossing the ocean no longer safe for the ships that Japan's empire had always assumed would be there. By 1945, Japan's foreign trade has declined by more than 60%. The decisive naval battle that Japan spent 20 years planning. The single afternoon that would shatter American will and force a negotiated peace. Never comes. Nimitz never gave them the conditions for it. The weapon he had counted on from the first week was finally doing what he knew it could do. 2 years late. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The USS Missouri sits at anchor. General Douglas MacArthur stands at the microphone on the forward deck. He speaks for 4 minutes. He describes what this moment means to civilization, to freedom, to the generations that will follow. When he finishes, the Japanese delegation steps forward and signs the documents on the table. Then it is Nimitz's turn. He steps to the table. He signs with one pen. He steps back. A yeoman hands him the pen afterward. He puts it in his pocket. One of the correspondents present writes that evening that Nimitz signed, and withdrew so quickly, it was easy to miss that he had been there at all. In the weeks that follow, the newspapers fill with photographs and retrospectives. MacArthur is named Supreme Commander for Japan. Halsey gives interviews. Spruance is profiled in several magazines. Nimitz flies back to Pearl Harbor. He has one task remaining. He writes his final report on the Pacific War, several hundred pages. Every major campaign from December 1941 to August 1945. He names the decisions that were correct. He names the operations that succeeded and explains why. He notes the failures. He does not name the individuals responsible for them. He submits it to the Navy Department. It receives no press coverage. There is a number that doesn't appear in that report. Not because Nimitz does not know it, because some numbers resist being written down cleanly in a document that will be filed and archived and read by strangers who were not there. 52 American submarines were lost in the Pacific War. 52 boats. 374 officers. 3,131 enlisted men. 3,505 total. The highest loss rate of any branch of the United States Armed Forces. 22% of all men who served on war patrols did not come home. Some were sunk by Japanese destroyers, some by depth charges in waters they had been ordered into, some hit mines they could not see. Some disappeared in circumstances that left no witness and no answer, and some of them, we will never know exactly how many, went to sea carrying a Mark 14 torpedo that the Bureau of Ordnance had certified as reliable, fired it at a target, and heard silence. Nimitz knew the difference between those deaths. He had signed the forms, overdue and presumed lost. He signed them for 21 months, while the Bureau of Ordnance answered every complaint from his submarine commanders the same way. The fault lies with the crews. He never said publicly what he thought of that answer. He fired the torpedoes into the cliff. Found in days what Washington had not found in 13 years of producing the weapon. Fixed it with a torpedo shop at Pearl Harbor and aluminum salvaged from Japanese aircraft that had come over on a Sunday morning in December, and went back to work. Chester Nimitz died on February 20th, 1966. He was 80 years old. He died at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay. The same Navy that had been his home for 60 years, providing the rooms where he spent his last years. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. The men buried beside him were not selected by protocol, not by rank, not by proximity to his fame. They were Raymond Spruance, Richmond Kelly Turner, Charles Lockwood, the man who had fought the Bureau of Ordnance from a desk at Pearl Harbor, who had fired torpedoes into a cliff because Washington wouldn't, who had rebuilt the weapon from the torpedo shop up, buried beside the man who sent those submarines to sea and signed the forms for the ones that didn't come back. They had arranged it while they were still alive. No announcement. No ceremony organized for cameras. Just the men who had done the work, together in the ground the way they had always preferred to operate. Out of the spotlight. Getting on with it. If your father served on a submarine in the Pacific, or your grandfather, I want to ask you something. Did he tell you about it? The men of that generation, as a rule, did not. Not at dinner. Not in the living room on Sunday afternoon. Not in the ordinary language of a life that had moved forward from what they had been through. But some of them talked. Late at night, to a wife. In a car on a long drive. To a son who didn't ask the right question until it was almost too late. In the last years of a life, when the things they had never said started finding their way out. Maybe he told you the name of his boat. Maybe he mentioned a patrol once, just once, and then went quiet and didn't explain. Maybe you found something after he was gone. A photograph, a service record, a patch from a boat whose history you never knew. If you have one of those stories, even a fragment, even something you only half remember, write it in the comments. The name of the boat, the year he served, whatever you know. Because those men went to sea with weapons that didn't work. And they went back out anyway. The stories they carried home, the ones that never made a newspaper, never appeared in any history book, told once at a kitchen table to people who loved them and didn't fully understand what they were hearing. Those stories are part of how this war was won. Don't let them disappear.
They weren't beaten by the Japanese. They were left behind by their own. On the night of August 9th, 1942, 11,000 Marines woke up and found the American fleet was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just an empty horizon where the day before there had been warships as far as the eye could see. Those ships took everything with them: food, ammunition, barbed wire, heavy equipment, everything you need to hold an island surrounded by the enemy. What was left? 37 days of rations, 4 days of ammunition, no air cover, no naval support, and an enemy that hadn't lost a single major ground battle since this war started. Washington had written the island off. The Navy had sailed away. Every military calculation pointed to the same conclusion. Guadalcanal was already lost. General Alexander Vandegrift stood on that beach and stared at that empty horizon. Then he turned his back on it. He opened his maps, and the decision he made in the next 6 hours would force Japan to do something it had never done in this war: retreat. This is the story of that night, and of the men who stayed. The greatest generation never asked for a parade, but they earned one. If someone in your family served anywhere, any branch, any war, put their name in the comments. Don't let their story disappear. To understand why a tiny island that appeared on almost no map in the world mattered so much, you have to understand where Japan stood in the summer of 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, they controlled a stretch of territory nearly the size of the continental United States. Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and now they were building an airfield on a small jungle island in the Solomon Islands, an island called Guadalcanal. That airfield wasn't a defensive installation. It was an offensive weapon. Operating from Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could directly threaten the supply lines running from the United States down to Australia and New Zealand. Cut those lines, and America loses its only staging ground for a counteroffensive in the Pacific. Every plan to push back against Japan would have to be thrown out and rewritten from scratch. Tokyo understood that. Washington understood it too. But the decision to strike back was made in such a rush it bordered on reckless. Planning took weeks instead of months. The maps the staff officers used to plan the landings were torn out of a National Geographic magazine. There were no proper aerial reconnaissance photos. No reliable information on terrain, weather, or how many Japanese troops were actually on the island. This is what Washington handed Vandegrift: an underprepared mission on an unsurveyed island with troops who hadn't finished training. Vandegrift knew all of that. He took the orders and didn't complain, because he was the kind of general who understood something that a lot of people sitting in Washington didn't. Japanese ground forces in the Pacific hadn't lost a major engagement yet. Waiting until everything was ready meant waiting until it was too late. On August 7th, 1942, the Marines hit the beach at Guadalcanal. They took the airfield in a single day. The Japanese garrison, mostly construction workers and a small Naval Guard unit, ran for the jungle. They left behind their equipment, their food stores, their building machinery, everything still neatly in place. Vandegrift thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. The morning of August 7th, the Marines came ashore under naval gunfire from offshore. They were ready for a fight. It didn't come. The Japanese on the island, mostly construction workers and a small naval guard, fled into the jungle. They left behind everything: construction equipment, bags of rice, canned food, cases of Japanese beer still stacked in a storage shed. By the end of the day, the Marines held the unfinished airfield. Vandegrift sent a report back to command. Progress better than expected. Nobody knew that was the last quiet moment the campaign would ever have. That same night, a few hundred miles to the north, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was driving a task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer hard toward Guadalcanal. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. In the early hours of August 9th, Mikawa's fleet slipped into Savo Sound in total darkness. No radar needed. The Japanese had spent years training for exactly this, night surface combat, while the American Navy had never made it a priority. What happened next took less than 40 minutes. 4 Allied cruisers went to the bottom: USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, the Australian cruiser Canberra. More than 1,000 sailors killed. It was the worst open-water defeat in the history of the United States Navy, and it happened while the Marines on the island were asleep. Mikawa looked around. The approach was wide open. American transports sitting offshore loaded with food, ammunition, equipment. Nothing left to protect them. He could have finished it right there. He didn't. Mikawa was worried about air attacks once daylight came. He turned his fleet around and headed back to Rabaul. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because those transports, even though Turner later ordered them out, had managed to offload just enough supplies to keep the Marines alive through the first months of the campaign. If Mikawa had destroyed them that night, Guadalcanal might have been over before it started. Admiral Turner got word of the Savo disaster before dawn. He ran the numbers. The escort fleet was effectively gone. Admiral Fletcher had already pulled his carriers out. Fletcher was worried about losses and left without giving proper notice. No air cover, no naval shield. Turner made his call. Every remaining transport, out, immediately, under cover of darkness. Nobody told Vandegrift before those ships weighed anchor. When the sun came up on August 9th, a Marine scout came running to find Vandegrift. He stepped outside and looked toward the water. Empty horizon. Not a single ship in sight. Vandegrift later wrote in his memoirs that it was the moment he felt completely abandoned. Not by the enemy, by his own navy. But he didn't write that at the time. At the time, he just walked back into his tent, called his staff officers together, and got to work. The staff meeting was quiet. Nobody panicked. Nobody raised their voice. Just officers sitting around a field table, looking at numbers on paper and understanding exactly where they stood. Vandegrift asked for a straight assessment, no sugarcoating, no false optimism. The results: 4 days of ammunition at full combat intensity, 37 days of food if they started rationing immediately. Not enough barbed wire to cover the full defensive perimeter, no artillery support, no air cover, and somewhere out there in the dark, an enemy already on its way. 11,000 men, on an island 90 miles long. No way out. 2 options on the table. Option 1, pull back, consolidate the entire force into a tight defensive ring around the beach, dig in, string the wire, wait for reinforcements. It was the safe call. The call every military textbook recommends when you're cut off and running low on supplies. Option 2. Finish the airfield. Not defense. Not waiting. Build the one thing that could change the math. A working runway. With an airfield, you can get aircraft. With aircraft, the Marines create their own air cover. No need to wait for the Navy to come back. But finishing the airfield meant moving men outside the defensive perimeter, spreading the force thin, accepting the risk of getting hit before they were ready. If the Japanese attacked before the airfield was done, there was no fallback plan. Vandegrift studied the map for a long moment. Then he pointed at the airfield. That decision wasn't made out of bravado. It came from seeing what option one didn't say out loud. Pulling back and waiting was just a slower way to die. Without the airfield, there was nothing to defend, nothing worth resupplying, and no reason for Washington to risk warships getting here. The Navy wasn't coming back for a beach. They might come back for an airfield. The airfield was the only reason to hold Guadalcanal. So finish it. The next morning, while one part of the force dug fighting positions, the rest picked up shovels and went to work on the runway. Under tropical sun that hit 100 degrees by mid-morning. In uniforms already soaked through before 8 o'clock. On half rations starting that first day. Most of them didn't fully understand what they were building. They just knew their general gave the order. And they worked. August 18th, 1942. 11 days after the Navy left. A Japanese reconnaissance plane flew over Guadalcanal and took photos. The runway was finished. The pilot couldn't believe what he was looking at. 11 days earlier, this had been a half-built construction project in the middle of jungle. Now it was a functioning airstrip, built by hand, using equipment the Japanese had abandoned, by men eating 2 meals a day in 100-degree heat. Vandegrift named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway 2 months before. The next day, 19 aircraft landed on Henderson Field. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, old planes, patched-together planes. Not the best America had, but they were here, on the island, under Marine control. Guadalcanal had air cover. Those pilots called themselves the Cactus Air Force, after Guadalcanal's Allied code name. There was nothing romantic about it. They slept in foxholes next to the runway because tents couldn't survive the bombing. They flew 3-4 missions a day. Take off, intercept Japanese aircraft, land, refuel, take off again. Between sorties, they lay down under the wings of their planes and slept, still in sweat-soaked flight suits. Fuel came from field drums, some of it pumped from sunken ships offshore. When a plane took enough damage to ground it permanently, the mechanics stripped every usable part and bolted it onto another aircraft. Nothing got wasted. Some mornings a pilot would walk out to his plane not entirely sure how many other aircraft it had been assembled from. They flew anyway. 900 miles to the north at Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto studied the intelligence report and immediately understood the problem. Henderson Field wasn't just an airstrip, it was a trap. Any fleet that approached Guadalcanal during daylight hours fell within range of aircraft from Henderson. Japanese ships could only operate in those waters at night, enough to shell the island, enough to land troops, but not enough to retake it. Yamamoto understood that better than anyone. He ordered a ground assault to retake the airfield, sent in some of his best units, trusted that one hard push would overrun Henderson Field before it became too well defended to crack. He badly underestimated how fast Vandegrift had built his lines, and he completely underestimated the men who were going to hold them. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki arrived at Guadalcanal with 900 of Japan's finest troops and an absolute certainty about what was going to happen. He didn't need reconnaissance, didn't need artillery preparation, didn't need a contingency plan. He had Japanese soldiers. That was enough. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki led his men in a direct charge along the beach east of Henderson Field. Simple tactics, almost contemptuous in their directness. Drive straight into the Marine lines at midnight, use speed and bayonets to break through before dawn. It had worked in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines. It didn't work here. The Marines were waiting. Barbed wire stopped the first wave cold at the bank of the Ilu River. Machine guns opened up from both flanks. Within minutes, the white sand was red. Ichiki sent a second wave, then a third. Each one broke apart on the wire. When daylight came, Vandegrift sent tanks and a full battalion around behind what was left of Ichiki's force. No escape route, nowhere to go. 800 of Ichiki's 900 men died on that sand. Ichiki burned his regimental colors, then he shot himself. It was the first time in this war that Japanese infantry attacked a properly defended American position and got wiped out, not pushed back, not repelled, wiped out. Vandegrift didn't celebrate. He knew Ichiki was just the first wave. He was right. In September, General Kawaguchi arrived with nearly 3,000 men, 3 times what Ichiki had brought, and he wasn't going to charge straight up the beach. Kawaguchi had learned the lesson. He pushed his men through the jungle, over terrain Vandegrift believed was impassable, and aimed directly at the high ground south of Henderson Field, a narrow ridge that would later be called Edson's Ridge. Hold that high ground, you hold the airfield. Lose it, you lose everything. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi attacked. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's line, fewer than 800 men, held off nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers through the night. By 3 in the morning, the perimeter had shrunk to less than 100 yards. Some positions had already broken. Japanese troops were inside the wire. Edson walked the line, calm, not raising his voice, looking every man he passed directly in the eye. This is it. There is no better place to die. The line held. Vandegrift got the call at 3:30 in the morning. The perimeter was holding. Barely. He looked at the list of available reserves. 1 battalion left. If he committed that battalion and the line still broke, there was nothing left to save Henderson Field. Nothing left to save Guadalcanal. He committed the battalion. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi was pulling what was left of his force back into the jungle. More than 600 Japanese soldiers were dead on that hillside. Henderson Field was still standing. Vandegrift sat down and, for the first time in weeks, let out a long breath. But he knew exactly what that meant. He had just used his last reserves. If Japan came back with the same size force, he had nothing left to stop them. Second Lieutenant Roy Elrod arrived on Guadalcanal in November 1942, weighing 190 pounds. He left weighing 165. 25 pounds gone in a matter of weeks, not from lack of trying, from lack of food. That was the reality of Guadalcanal after the big battles. Not artillery, not night attacks, just the island grinding men down, day after day, in its own quiet way. At night, the Tokyo Express ran. Japan couldn't move troops during daylight. Henderson Field controlled the sky. But the darkness was theirs. Japanese destroyers ran down the passage the Marines called the Slot, New Georgia Sound, at full speed, offloaded men and supplies on the beach before sunrise, and were gone before the Cactus Air Force could touch them. Every night they came. Every morning, Vandegrift looked at the map and knew more Japanese troops had just come ashore. There was no way to stop them in the dark. In the jungle, disease was killing more Marines than Japanese bullets. By the time the 1st Marine Division was finally relieved in December 1942, more than 8,000 of its men had contracted malaria. Tropical disease had taken 2 out of every 3 men off the line, while enemy fire accounted for only 1 in 3 casualties. Elrod remembered one night sitting on a wooden crate in the pouring rain, shaking with malaria, doubled over with dysentery, Japanese mortar rounds landing behind him, mosquitoes everywhere. He looked up at the sky and thought, I wonder why they can't get one of those rounds in here where it would do some good. That wasn't a man who wanted to die. That was a man who had hit the absolute limit and was still sitting there, still holding his position, because there was nowhere else to go. The order had come down. Unless your fever was over 104 degrees, you didn't leave your post for sickbay. Vandegrift knew all of it. He walked the forward positions every day, looking at hollowed-out faces, uniforms hanging off men who had nothing left to lose. He didn't tell them reinforcements were coming, because he wasn't sure they were. He sent a cable to Washington, not asking to withdraw, not complaining, just reporting the facts, so that if they couldn't hold, Washington would understand why. The cable went unanswered for days. The men who had been on the island longest were surviving on whatever the jungle could give them: coconuts, taro root, lizard meat, and rice taken off dead Japanese soldiers. These were the same men who had won at the Tenaroo River, who had held Edson's Ridge, who had built Henderson Field with their bare hands. Now they were eating their enemies' food to make it through one more day, and not one of them talked about quitting. While the Marines were holding on by their fingernails, something else was happening that neither side fully understood yet. Japan was bleeding out, not in troops, though the ground losses were severe, but in something far harder to replace. Over Guadalcanal's skies, Japan's most experienced aviators were dying mission by mission. These weren't ordinary pilots. They were the men who had trained for years before the war, who had flown over China and Burma, who had attacked Pearl Harbor and Midway. Japan had spent a decade building that corps of airmen. They could not be replaced in months. They could barely be replaced in years. Every day the Cactus Air Force scrambled to defend Henderson Field. It was trading patched-together wildcats and exhausted young pilots against Japan's irreplaceable veterans. And Japan was losing that trade badly. By the time the campaign ended, Japan had lost more than 600 aircraft over and around Guadalcanal. More importantly, the experienced crews who had given those aircraft their edge were gone. Yamamoto understood what that meant better than anyone in Tokyo. He had watched Japan's naval air power, built over a decade, tested at Pearl Harbor and Midway, get systematically destroyed over a jungle airstrip in the Solomon Islands. He knew what came next. Japan could still fight. But the kind of war they could fight in 1943 was not the same war they had launched in 1941. The initiative was gone. The experienced aviators were gone. The margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing, all because the men on that island refused to leave. On October 18, 1942, a message reached the officers on Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley had been relieved of command. His replacement, Admiral William Halsey. The Marines read that and, for the first time in weeks, laughed. Not because Halsey brought immediate relief, not because everything changed overnight, but because that name meant Washington had finally figured it out. Guadalcanal wasn't a place for passive defense. It needed someone willing to fight. Halsey fought. Supplies started arriving with more regularity. Reinforcements came in. The Cactus Air Force got more planes. For the first time since August, Vandegrift could look at his map without calculating how many days he had left. But here's what history tends to gloss over. Halsey arrived on October 18th, the Battle of the Tenaroo, Marines won. Edson's Ridge, Marines held. Henderson Field, finished and operational. All of that happened before Halsey set foot in the area. Vandegrift had held Guadalcanal for 11 weeks. No Navy, no reliable supply line, no clear orders beyond 2 words: hold. Halsey didn't save Guadalcanal. He took an island Vandegrift had already held together with his bare hands and carried it to final victory. In December 1942, the 1st Marine Division was pulled off the island. The men who could still walk made their way to the beach on their own. The ones who couldn't were carried. More than 8,000 of them had malaria. Most had lost 20 pounds or more. Their uniforms hung off bodies that looked nothing like they had 4 months earlier. They looked back at the island one last time as the ships pulled out. Nobody recorded what they were thinking. But the island was still theirs. In February 1943, Japan quietly evacuated the last 10,000 soldiers remaining on Guadalcanal over 3 consecutive nights. The withdrawal was executed so perfectly that American intelligence initially thought it was a new offensive. When the truth was confirmed, Guadalcanal was over. For the first time in this war, Japan had given up territory it had taken, not because they were outnumbered, not because they ran out of weapons, but because they had run into something their military machine had no formula for: men who'd been left behind and refused to lose. Alexander Vandegrift never became a household name. No Hollywood blockbuster, no iconic photograph with sunglasses and a corncob pipe, no quote in the history textbooks that every school kid can recite. He was just the man who stood on a beach on the darkest night of the war, watched the last ship disappear, and turned his back on that empty horizon. In 1943, Vandegrift was awarded the Medal of Honor, not for a single moment of heroism, for 4 straight months of making the right call when there was no right call to make. General Douglas MacArthur said it best after the war was over. Before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours. That shift, from Japan advancing to Japan retreating, started on a half-built runway in the jungle, built by starving men with Japanese equipment on an island their own navy had abandoned. Every campaign that came after, Bougainville, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The road to Tokyo itself ran through that runway. It didn't belong to the admirals who sailed away. It didn't belong to the generals in Washington. It belonged to the men who stayed. They were abandoned. They stayed. They won.